Okay, so are you ready for this? Imagine this. You're in the middle of a huge construction project in Manila.
High stakes, high rises.
Exactly. And suddenly the deal goes sour. What happens next?
You're thinking lawsuits, right? Maybe some negotiation.
Well, this case, Chanelay Development Corporation versus Government Service Insurance System, takes a few unexpected turns.
It throws in contract law principles that'll make you think twice about signing on the dotted line.
It really highlights the difference between rescission and termination, which even some lawyers mix up.
And it shows how things can go so wrong that one party ends up losing everything they put into a project.
We're talking about Chanelay Towers, formerly known as Canline Tower 2, a prime piece of Manila real estate.
Owned by GSIS, the Government Service Insurance System.
They wanted this tower of renovated, unsold units moved. So they bring in Chanelay Development Corporation, CDC, and that's where the drama begins.
It all starts with a joint venture agreement, or JVA, between GSIS and CDC.
Basically a business partnership, right?
Exactly. CDC's job was to renovate the tower, sell the units, and pay GSIS a guaranteed P180,300,000 tokas.
That's a lot of money.
Plus 71% of any profits from the sales.
Sounds like a pretty sweet deal for GSIS.
It seemed that way at first. But hold on.
Okay, what happened?
CDC starts the renovations in 1995, but then they miss payment deadlines, start building extra units without permission, even rent some out.
Wait, they went rogue. Didn't they realize that would cause problems?
Oh, it definitely did. GSIS finds out about these breaches and says enough is enough.
So they terminate the JVA.
In 1998, they pulled the plug. Now, remember that clause in the agreement we talked about? The one about improvements becoming GSIS property without reimbursement if things go south.
Uh-oh, that doesn't sound good for CDC.
It wasn't all the work they'd done, all the money invested, poof, gone, just like that.
Seriously. They just walked away with nothing.
Well, CDC wasn't about to go down without a fight. They sued GSIS, claiming the agreement was actually a partnership, not a JVA.
So they're saying they were misled.
In a way. They wanted that guaranteed payment clause thrown out and argued they should be allowed to hand over some units instead of all that cash.
So it became a legal battle over what their agreement really meant.
Exactly. And the first round went to GSIS. The regional trial court sided with them, upheld the termination, ordered CDC to pay the full guaranteed amount plus interest and forfeit all the improvements.
Sounds like a clean sweep for GSIS.
They even nullified any dealings CDC had with third parties regarding the property.
Wow. So that's a case closed.
Not quite. The Court of Appeals agreed with most of the trial court's decision, but they did throw CDC a little bone.
Oh.
They said GSIS couldn't have both rescission and specific performance. They couldn't cancel the deal and get that massive payment.
I'm starting to see why this case is so interesting. So much legal back and forth. What happened next?
Both CDC and GSIS appealed certain parts of the appeals court's decision to the Supreme Court.
So they both thought they could get a better outcome.
Exactly. They each had their own arguments for why the Supreme Court should side with them.
Okay, I'm on the edge of my seat. Did the Supreme Court side with CDC or GSIS?
Well, it's not as simple as that.
Oh, come on. You can't leave us hanging.
The Supreme Court actually denied both appeals.
You mean they basically upheld the Court of Appeals decision?
Precisely. So no big payout for GSIS, and CDC was still left with the consequences of the termination.
Wow, this is getting complicated.
Yeah.
So how does this case connect to those legal terms you mentioned earlier?
One of the key takeaways is the difference between rescission and termination.
I'm all ears.
Rescission aims to put everything back the way it was before the contract. It's like hitting the rewind button, undoing the past.
Okay, so it's all about going back to square one. What about termination?
Termination is about ending the agreement moving forward. It's about stopping things in their tracks, preventing further obligations or actions.
So in this case, GSIS choosing termination meant they couldn't also demand that massive guaranteed payment.
Exactly. They had to pick one or the other.
That makes sense. What other legal concepts came into play in this case?
Another important one was reformation of instrument.
Okay, now you're just using fancy legal jargon on me.
It's simpler than it sounds. It's basically when a party claims that the written contract doesn't reflect what they actually agreed to.
So like a, hey, that's not what we meant kind of thing.
Pretty much CDC tried that argument, saying the JVA didn't truly reflect their intentions, but the courts weren't buying it.
So they were saying there was a difference between what they thought they were agreeing to and what was actually in the contract.
Right. But the court said the contract language was clear enough. There wasn't enough evidence to support CDC's claims.
So reformation of instrument isn't an easy out. It's not just about having second thoughts after you've signed something.
Exactly. Contracts are meant to be binding agreements. Courts don't like to rewrite them unless there's a very good reason.
This is starting to feel very relevant even for someone like me who doesn't deal with complex contracts every day. Are there any other key takeaways that our listeners should keep in mind?
Absolutely. This case also highlights the concept of scope of authority.
That sounds important. Break it down for us.
It's about how much power someone has to act on behalf of another person or entity.
I'm with you so far.
In this case, CDC argued they had the authority to make agreements with other companies, but the Supreme Court said nope, their role was limited.
So they overstepped their boundaries.
You could say that the Supreme Court made it clear exceeding your scope of authority can have big consequences.
Now I'm curious about those other companies, the ones CDC made deals with. What happened to them?
Oh, they got caught in the crossfire.
This seems unfair.
It was a tough spot for them. The Supreme Court basically said they should have been more careful before doing business with CDC.
Ouch. So it's like a cautionary tale about being careful who you trust.
Definitely. It's a reminder that when you're dealing with an agent in any situation, you need to be clear about what they're allowed to do.
This whole case really shows how crucial it is to understand the ins and outs of a contract before you sign.
It does, and it emphasizes the principle that you're generally bound by the terms you agree to, even if you end up regretting it.
No takebacks.
Not without a good legal reason. Contracts are there to provide stability. If people could just back out whenever they wanted, things would be chaos.
Right. I get that. But I keep thinking about that forfeiture clause where CDC lost all their investment.
That's a great point. It raises questions about fairness.
It does seem harsh.
The Supreme Court acknowledged it was a big consequence, but they pointed out that CDC knew about that clause when they signed the JVA.
So it's like, you signed it, you're bound by it.
Essentially, yes. And remember, it was CDC who breached the contract, not GSIS.
True. So the forfeiture clause was like a safety net for GSIS.
Exactly. It's a way to deter breaches and protect GSIS's interests.
This case is making me think about risk. Who takes on more risk when signing a contract?
That's a key question. CDC took on more risk knowing they'd face big consequences if they didn't hold up their end of the deal.
So this case is about more than just reading the fine print. It's about understanding the potential downsides.
Absolutely. It's about protecting yourself, A&E being aware of how your actions can affect others.
I'm starting to see how this seemingly simple real estate deal has so many layers. It's about fairness, responsibility, the power of legal agreements.
Exactly. It shows how the law works in real-world situations.
It definitely makes you think twice about signing anything.
That's the goal of our deep dives, to make you more informed.
This is great. But why should our listeners care about a Supreme Court case about a real estate deal in the Philippines? How does this apply to them?
Well, the specifics might seem niche, but the core principles are universal. Remember the difference between rescission and termination.
Right. Undoing the past versus stopping things moving forward.
That applies to any contract. Understanding the difference could help you avoid problems.
And what about that scope of authority issue? That seems pretty important too.
It is. It's relevant to anyone who works with agents or representatives. It highlights the importance of clear communication and avoiding misunderstandings.
And due diligence, right.
Mm-hmm.
Taking the time to really understand a contract before you sign.
Absolutely. These are lessons that apply whether you're negotiating a business deal, signing a lease, or even making a personal agreement with someone.
I'm feeling much more knowledgeable about contract law now.
That's what we aim for, to make complex topics accessible.
Before we move on, is there anything else you think our listeners should consider?
We've talked about the legal aspects, but there's also an ethical question. Was that forfeiture clause truly fair?
That's a tough one. What are your thoughts?
Well, CDC agreed to the terms, but losing everything does seem extreme.
So no easy answer.
It's about balancing upholding contracts with fairness. It's something to think about as you navigate your own agreements.
This conversation has given us so much to think about. We started with a real estate dispute, and now we're exploring ethics.
The law is connected to so many parts of our lives.
Now we want to hear from you, our listeners. What do you think about the forfeiture clause in this case? Was it fair or did it go too far? Let us know in the comments below.
We love hearing your perspectives.
And don't forget to hit that like button if you found this deep dive interesting. It helps others find the show and join the conversation.
We appreciate you being part of our community of curious minds.
And speaking of community, don't forget to subscribe to the deep dive for more explorations of fascinating legal cases, complex topics, and thought-provoking questions. We're here to help you navigate the world of information overload and make sense of it all.
We'll see you in the next deep dive.
Yeah, it does feel like they were kind of left hanging.
It highlights the importance of due diligence.
So making sure you really know who you're doing business with.
Exactly. You need to understand their authority, your track record.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay, back to the main players. This whole case really shows how important it is to understand a contract, right? Like every detail, every clause.
It does. And it also shows how the law generally upholds the terms of a contract, even if things don't go as planned.
So no buyer's remorse allowed?
Pretty much. Unless there's a really strong legal reason, contracts are all about predictability and stability.
Otherwise, everyone could just back out and it would be chaos.
Exactly.
But I still keep thinking about that forfeiture clause, the one where CDC lost everything they invested.
That's a common reaction. A lot of people find that aspect of the case troubling.
It does seem kind of harsh,
The Supreme Court did acknowledge that. It was a big consequence.
but they still upheld it.
They did. They pointed out that CDC knew about that clause when they signed the JVA.
So it's like a you knew the risks situation.
Yeah, and they also emphasized that it was CDC who breached the contract, not GSIS.
Right. So the forfeiture clause was there to protect GSIS.
Exactly. It acts as a deterrent against breaches and helps ensure that GSIS isn't left high and dry.
So there's this element of risk allocation in contracts.
Absolutely. Both parties need to understand the potential downsides.
This case is really making me think differently about contracts. It's not just about the words on the page. It's about all these bigger implications.
That's what makes it so fascinating. We're talking about fairness, responsibility, and the power dynamics within agreements.
It's like a microcosm of how the law works in the real world.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. But why should our listeners care about a Supreme Court case about a real estate deal in the Philippines? Seems pretty specific.
Well, the specifics might seem niche, but the underlying principles are universal, like the distinction between rescission and termination.
Right, undoing the past versus stopping things moving forward.
That applies